The Ottoman Empire was one of the longest-lasting dynasties in history, ruling for over 600 years and spanning 3 continents. But how did it suddenly vanish after World War I? Why didn't they see the writing on the wall when their European neighbors were getting colonized by outside powers, or resist with more force? Or why didn't they turn to nationalism as a way to try and save their empire? And why is this guy wearing a hat? Today we'll find out why the Ottoman Empire vanished so quickly. In 1922, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk led a group of Ottomans into a war against the British who had occupied Istanbul. After the British retreated, he went on to establish the Republic of Turkey, and the Ottoman dynasty ended. But why did this happen? Well, there are 6 reasons for this, starting with World War I. In World War I, the Ottomans sided with the Central Powers, hoping to gain territory in the Middle East. However, after heavy defeats, Arab leaders revolted against them, and the British began to march on Istanbul. So why didn't the Ottomans just switch sides? Well, switching sides wasn't that easy. You see, siding with Germany meant that they had made concessions to them and vice versa, and making such a switch would undermine the trust between nations. It would also be very difficult to justify to their people, not to mention their military alliance with Germany. The Ottoman army was trained with German officers and used German weapons and tactics. Therefore, it would be very difficult for them to just start fighting against them. Plus, the Ottomans thought that winning the war was possible. In fact, they were doing quite well at first. For example, in the Battle of Karansebes, the Ottomans ambushed and defeated an Austrian force of 50,000 Russians and 4,000 Serbs. That's like defeating Stormzy and Dave in a rap battle. However, as time wore on, the Ottomans lost many key battles and eventually the war. This shows us that the Ottomans' decision to side with Germany was a huge gamble which ultimately backfired. But why didn't the Ottomans resist the British during their occupation of Istanbul? We'll find out next. After World War I, the Ottomans were in no condition to keep fighting. Their army was completely worn out, their economy was devastated, and most of their population had died. As a result, there was no real desire to keep fighting the British. In fact, many Ottomans actually welcomed the British because they saw them as liberators from the Germans. Not to mention the Turkish War of Independence had already begun before the armistice between the Ottomans and the Allies. Therefore, the Turkish people felt that the war was already lost. Instead of continuing to fight the British, the Turks focused on kicking out the remaining Germans. And this led to the Turkish War of National Liberation, where the Turks fought against everyone, including the British, French, Greeks, and Armenians. This war showed that the Ottoman Empire was in its death throes. But why didn't the Ottomans use nationalism as a tool to try and save their empire? Well, you see, nationalism had been on the decline since the Tanzimat reforms. During this period, the Ottoman Sultan tried to modernize the Ottoman Empire. He introduced things such as a written language based on Latin characters instead of the old Arabic one. He also reformed the legal system and started to build infrastructure, such as roads, railways, and factories. And to achieve these goals, he needed his subjects to focus on being loyal to the state rather than to their religion or ethnic group. This policy of millet was designed to integrate the diverse peoples of the Ottoman Empire by granting them self-governing institutions that were separate from the central government. This worked to some extent, as evidenced by the fact that the Ottomans were able to remain stable for several decades. However, this also meant that nationalism never really took root in the Ottoman Empire. Unlike in Russia, where there was a strong sense of Russian nationalism, or in Germany, where there was a strong sense of German nationalism. In the Ottoman Empire, the various groups within the empire, such as the Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, and Turks, identified more with their religion than with their nation. Therefore, when the empire began to collapse, there was no strong national identity that could unite them and fight for the empire. This lack of nationalism is a reason why the Ottoman Empire collapsed so quickly. But why didn't the Ottomans see the writing on the wall and realize that their neighbors were getting colonized? Well, it's true that the Ottomans did recognize that their neighbors were losing independence. But unlike the Russians, Germans, and Austrians, the Ottomans weren't threatened by this. Why? Well, in order to understand this, we need to look at how the Ottoman Empire differed from the other European empires. First of all, it spanned 3 continents, making it a transcontinental empire. This meant that they couldn't be invaded in the same way that the Europeans could. To invade the Ottomans, you would have to cross the Mediterranean Sea, which was very difficult to do back then. And the Ottomans knew this, which gave them a false sense of security. Secondly, the Ottomans had learned from their neighbors' mistakes. When the Mongols took over Russia, they avoided the trap of letting them pass through. They kept them far away in Siberia. And when the Austrians were taken over by the Habsburgs, the Ottomans stopped trading with them. This isolationist policy of Ibrari meant that they cut themselves off from Europe and its problems, which included colonization. By cutting off trade with Europe, the Ottomans were able to prevent European powers from gaining economic and political influence over them. They also used the policy of Ibrari to stop the spread of European ideas that could threaten the authority of the Sultan. For example, the Ottomans banned the printing of books in European languages. And lastly, the Ottomans believed that their empire was superior to the European ones. They believed that they were a divine empire chosen by God to rule over all Muslims. This belief in their superiority prevented them from seeing the threat posed by colonialism. And speaking of their beliefs, that takes us to our next question, which is, why did they believe that their empire was superior to the others? Well, like many empires before and after them, the Ottomans believed that their empire was superior because of religion. You see, the Ottomans were Muslim, and they believed that it was their duty to spread Islam around the world. They also believed that non-Muslims were inferior to them. For example, the Ottomans enslaved many Christians and Jews throughout their empire. This belief in their own superiority prevented them from seeing the threat posed by European colonialism. In fact, the Ottomans were the ones who colonized large parts of North Africa and the Middle East. And so they didn't see anything wrong with it. It wasn't until the Europeans came along that the Ottomans realized that they were also colonizing people. But why did the Ottomans get involved in the arms race in the first place? Well, the answer lies in their relationship with Europe. The Ottomans' rivalry with Russia goes back to the early days of both empires. The Ottomans were suspicious of Russia's growing power and influence in the Black Sea region, which threatened their access to the Mediterranean. Additionally, the Ottomans feared Russia's potential to become a gateway for European colonialism into the Middle East. On top of this, there was the issue of Constantinople, which the Ottomans renamed Istanbul. The city had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire and was a symbol of Orthodox Christianity. The Ottomans saw the city as a strategic asset due to its location at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. They believed that controlling the city would give them an important advantage over Russia and prevent Russia from dominating the Black Sea region. The Ottomans' desire to maintain control over Constantinople was further fueled by Russian interest in the city. In the 1870s, Russia made an attempt to capture Constantinople, which alarmed the Ottomans and increased their determination to hold on to the city. The Ottomans' desire to maintain control over Constantinople and their suspicion of Russia's intentions in the region drove them to engage in an arms race with Russia. However, the arms race turned out to be a bad idea because it drained their resources and left them weakened. In fact, it was the only major empire in the world to survive two arms races. But the reason why the Ottomans survived the first one and not the second one is because of Russia. You see, the first arms race was between Britain, France, and Germany. And since the Ottomans sided with Germany, they were able to get cheap weapons. The second arms race was between Britain and Germany. And since the Ottomans sided with neither of them, they had to pay full price for their weapons. And lastly, why did the Ottomans even want to compete with the Europeans in the first place? Well, like the rest of the world, the Ottomans wanted to become stronger and more powerful. You see, the Industrial Revolution was changing the balance of power in the world, and the Ottomans wanted to make sure that they were on the winning side. They hoped that by modernizing their army, they would be able to defeat Russia and expand their empire. But as we know, that didn't happen. Instead, the Ottomans were defeated and their empire collapsed. Thank you for watching.